In 1986, which seems a long time ago, I was seconded for 3 months from Sheffield City Polytechnic to identify ancient woods in Sheffield. Now, an ancient wood is one that we know from documentary evidence has been in existence since at least 1600. And if it's been in existence since 1600, it's called an ancient wood. It goes into another category of heritage. And at the time that I was seconded from Sheffield City Polytechnic, the City Council had a big poster in their new wildlife gallery at the Western Park Museum that said there are 2 ancient woods in Sheffield, Ecclesall Woods and Warncliffe Woods. Well, Warncliffe Woods is in Barnsley for a start, so that brought it down to 1. So at that point, they seconded me to work in the archives in Sheffield to find documentary evidence of woodlands. And at the end of 3 months, I'd identified 49 ancient woods. And what you may not realise is that what this means is that you live, even if you didn't know it, you live in the best wooded city in the country. 49% of Sheffield's population live within a 5-minute walk of an ancient wood. In Nottingham, the home of Robin Hood, it's only 5%. So that's the difference. So what I want to talk about tonight are ancient woods. And Penny's mentioned the leaflet. Actually, it's the second one I've done, because I did the first one in 1990, and then the new one just a few years ago. So the rest of the talk is based on slides. This is me and a couple of friends. Bob Warburton, one of them, an artist, a wildlife artist, who illustrated a lot of my books. I've got some books on sale for you at the end, if anybody's interested. Walking up the Lim Valley at Dore, Worlow area, in autumn. And I think most people seem to think that woodlands are only to do with natural history. But there's much more than that are to do with our history and our culture and our heritage. And you can go and investigate a woodland at any time of the year. And to get the balance, to understand a wood, you've got to try to put together a woodland biography. And you've got to do its history through documents. You've got to do its natural history. You've got to do its archaeology. And you've got to look at its ecology. And one of the best things about going to a wood in autumn is that when the leaves have dropped and the vegetation's gone down to ground level, you can see the bare bones of the wood. You can see the archaeology very clearly. It's a wonderful time to go into a wood. The only month I don't bother going into a wood is, well, July and August, when the vegetation's high and all the birds have stopped singing and they've stopped nesting and it's not as interesting. But other parts of the year is absolutely fantastic. I mean, you go into a wood in autumn. If you go into Wincobank Wood, for instance, this is what you'll see on a frosty morning. Oak leaves. But they're not just oak leaves, because if you look very carefully, you'll notice that this oak leaf has a stalk on it. That means it's a certain type of oak. It's called sessile oak, and that's the oak that's native to our area. And Wincobank Wood is a sessile oak wood. The other oak, which is called Quercus robur, doesn't have a stalk on its leaf, but it does have a stalk on its acorn. Our sessile oaks have a stalk on the leaf and no stalk on the acorn. Investigate next time you go into a wood. So you can go to a wood and see things at any time of the year. That's a wren's nest. And look what the wren's done with the sessile oak leaf. It's put it on its step, just outside its nest. So you can investigate the natural history of a woodland, but there's much more to it than that. I don't know if you've seen these in Wincobank Wood. This is a speckled butterfly. And until 2002, the furthest north I'd ever seen this butterfly was in the New Forest in Hampshire. And in 2002, one appeared at the top of our stairs to announce to me that it had arrived in South Yorkshire. And George Bush still says there's no global warming. It's now colonised the Shetland Islands. It's moving north. It's the most common butterfly in South Yorkshire's woods now. Look for it next time you go out. And it spirals up and attacks another male. I mean, when you go into the woodland in spring, you look up to the trees, that's looking up into a hornbeam tree. And that's a special tree. That's not native to this area. It's only native to an area south of Cambridge and Bristol. But it was planted in Sheffield woods for one very special reason. Hornbeam means hard wood, and it's very hard wood. And they grew it to make cogs for the water-powered sites that were on all Sheffield's rivers. Special reason for planting a tree, hornbeam. And of course in autumn, you can all go on a fungal foray and identify all the different fungi in the woods. So you can go to a woodland at any time of the year. This is a special thing. This is a wood ant's nest. And the special place to go and look at those is in Grenna Woods. And they're all on the north side of paths and rides through the wood because it needs as much sunshine from the south to keep them warm. And they're absolutely full of ants, and there are umpteen of them. And they feed on a special flower called common cowweed, which gives out a nice sort of creamy nice thing that the ants like. And you get common cowweed and wood ants together in the same woods. But as I say, it's much more than natural history. It's to do with our history and heritage. This is a green man. And there are 15 churches in South Yorkshire with green men in them. And people argue with a toss about what they mean. But one significant meaning is that they're celebrating the change in the seasons and the coming of spring. And it's always a face with leaves, usually oak-like, coming out of the mouth, sometimes out of the ears, and sometimes out of the eyes. That's in Watherpond Church, Watherpond Parish Church. In Rotherham, if you go in there, there are 32 of them carved into the columns of the church. And this is a pagan symbol in Christian churches. Look at him. He's in the cloisters at Norwich Cathedral, and when you're walking around, you can feel his eyes following you. Because most people lived in or near woods in the past. I mean, there are something like 50 place names in South Yorkshire that indicate that it was woodland. Every Lee name, like Longley and Barnsley and Tankersley. Lee means woodland clearing. And field, as in Sheffield, doesn't mean field. It means a treeless area in an otherwise well-wooded landscape. So Sheffield means a treeless area in an otherwise well-wooded landscape beside the River Sheaf. Bradfield, a treeless area in an otherwise well-wooded landscape which is broad, and so on. Now, I haven't got one of these in South Yorkshire, but you find them in churches up and down the country. This is the wild man of the woods. Because woodlands were always associated with wild men. And it's not only our sort of cultural history, but our economic history. This is a painting done about 1900, and it shows a charcoal maker. This is his hut. This is his assistant taking the 4-foot lengths of wood over to make a charcoal stack. He's just raking the end of a charcoal burn to get at the charcoal. And all Sheffield's industry was based on charcoal, not coal. That's why the woods have survived. That's why it's the best wooded city in the country. Because all the woods were useful and an intrinsic part of the local economy. And if you go in Ecclesall Woods, of course, you can find the charcoal maker's monument. And I mean, you think of South Yorkshire's being made of stone. But before it's made of stone, every building, even the parish churches and the castles, were made of timber. This is a little bit of a barn on the boundary between South Yorkshire and West Yorkshire at Gunthwaite. And it's 60 feet long. It's now shared between two different farms. It dates from the 1690s. It's absolutely beautiful. That's the ceiling of the roof in the nave in Rotherham Parish Church. All made out of local timber. Right, let's start at the beginning. The beginning of the history of local woodlands is about 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. The temperatures grew, improved, and the ice melted, and the ground thawed. So that'd be what it was like at Bradfield about 12,000 years ago. The snow's going in a tundra landscape. The wind blows, and seeds that are blown on the wind, like willow and birch, come in and colonise the ground, and then animals and birds bring them from those parts of Europe that haven't been under the ice. So a blackbird eats a berry in northern France at breakfast time, defecates in Kent at lunchtime on its colonisation northwards, and there we are. So, and by about 8,000 BC, within 4,000 years, the whole of the British Isles, from Land's End to John O'Groats, were covered by woodland, which had been called the wildwood. There isn't any wildwood left in Britain because there's been so much involvement of men in cultivating and using it. And you've got to go to somewhere like Poland to find the wildwood today. There's a beautiful forest in Poland that's still full of bison. It's still got bison in the wildwoods in Poland. It's absolutely fantastic. So that's what it would have looked like from Land's End to John O'Groats, with the odd clearing kept clear by grazing animals, by wild cattle and reindeer at first until they moved north, and deer. I don't know if you know about the man in the ice. This is a man that found in the ice in the Austrian Alps in 1991 and thought a long time he'd been under the ice. Two hikers found him and reported him to the police. The police said, "Oh God, that teacher went missing in 1937. And then they said, "Oh no." They found a walking stick with him and they thought it was a Victorian one. They thought somebody else would be missing in 1897. In fact, this man is 2,500 years old. And he was an alpine shepherd. And they don't know how he died. He might have been murdered. But the interesting thing is that he had about him tools and weapons made from 18 different species of shrub and tree. They knew exactly the use of every tree. He had blackthorn berries, sloes, to eat. He had a fantastic rucksack with a frame of larch and covered by birch bark. He had a bow made out of yew and arrows, and he even had his own travelling medical kit which was tied to his wrist, and it was fungus. And scientists have analysed what was in that fungus, and they now realise it contained antibiotics. This is a man 2,500 years ago. Came from a community that understood these things. And since then, for thousands of years after he died, all our woodlands were used, they were part of the local economy. Until about 1900, when we started increasingly using steel and iron and plastics. This is the first way in which we use woodlands. Were wooded commons, were part of the common land of a community. And people could graze their animals, and they could take timber, and what they did, you pollarded the trees, you cut them periodically above the grazing height of an animal. And it grew back, and every 20 years it could come back and cut it again. And these two girls, this is from a famous painting by Miles Burkitt Foster, these two girls are gathering up beech mast in buckets to feed to pigs. And that's something that had gone on for centuries and centuries. So wooded commons, this is called wood pasture. There he is. You knock down the acorns if they're not on the ground to feed your pigs, and that was called pannage. And it went on in September and October every year. And the records locally, Sheffield Deer Park, Rivelin Valley, Loxley, all being used for pannage in the medieval period. This is from the Luttrell Psalter, a manuscript that was produced between 1320 and 1332. And look at, can you see the swineherd up the tree knocking acorns down for the pigs? And that's a very hungry pig climbing up. And there's one down there eating them. Pannage. And this is Loxley Common. And this is one of two pollards that still survive on Loxley Common. But the other type of wood pasture that was very common was in deer parks. And this is a typical deer park in that there are woods in the background where the deer can go and take cover at night, and then during the daytime they come out into these treeless areas which are called lawns, L-A-U-N-D, which is the equivalent of the modern day lawn, of course, where they grazed. And then in these treeless areas occasionally you get these mighty ancient trees. So these are the three elements of a deer park. And a deer park was not for hunting. A deer park was where you farmed your animals very carefully. And this is this is an ancient tree that used to stand in Wortley Deer Park. It's now the gardens at Wortley. It's 23 feet in circumference. It's probably been there since Shakespeare's day. In fact, we interviewed the daughter of the late Earl of Warncliffe last year, and she told us that for generations it was the custom of her family that the children came down and climbed into inside the tree. And she still does it, even though the tree doesn't belong to her today. And from about the year 1300, it was deemed that all the deer in the country belonged to the king. And you've got to get a license to create a deer park. And this is an example of a license with its royal seal on it. And you can see all the deer underneath. And the huntsman in the corner. And I know of... there was a certain type of license called a right of free warren, which gave the owner the right to hunt small animals, and this usually led to the creation of the deer park. And something like more than 80 rights of free warren were given in South Yorkshire alone, and resulted in the creation of something like 32 deer parks. This is the last local royal licence that was ever granted. 1637, by King Charles I to the owner of Sandbeck Park near Maltby, Viscount Castleton. And they've still got that licence in their record office. It's all in Latin. This is how you captured a deer in a deer park. You didn't go out and shoot it with an arrow. You got your dogs and you sent it towards nets, where bowmen then brought them down. The hunting took place in what were called the Royal Forests, and their private equivalent, chases. And the three chases in South Yorkshire, Rivelin Chase, Warncliffe Chase, Hatfield Chase. And that's where you just found one red deer and you chased it until it was exhausted, and then you stabbed it through the chest with a dagger. There's a famous painting of a deer being brought to Queen Elizabeth I, and there she is like that. But these people, they would be drawing them towards the nets, and that would be because they wanted deer for meat for a big feast. When the 5th Earl of Shrewsbury died in the 1560, I think it was, there was something like 30 odd fallow deer and 20 odd red deer were killed. The red deer would have been in Riverland Chase, the fallow deer would have been in Sheffield Deer Park, that were killed for his funeral feast. This is a map by John Speed of 1610, showing the surviving deer parks in South Yorkshire. That's Conisborough. That's Thryburgh, still there as a golf course now, with the hall in the middle. That's Kimberworth Deer Park, and beyond it there's Tankersley. The big one down in the left-hand corner, that's Sheffield. That was one of the biggest deer parks in the country, 2,500 acres. And in 1637 it still had 1,000 deer in it, fallow deer. And some of the trees in Sheffield Deer Park were absolutely astounding. A man called John Evelyn wrote a book in 1670 about trees, and it was corresponding with the Parker of Sheffield Park, and he described some absolutely massive oak trees. There was one that had fallen down, and two men on horses on either side couldn't see each other's hats because it was so big. And there's another one that he said that 250 horses could stand in its shade. And he gave all his calculations, and he said there were more than 1,000 trees of that sort of size standing in Sheffield Deer Park. So this is wood pasture. But what was happening was that as the medieval period drew on, the population was rising, and things had to change. This is another deer park. This is Tankersley Deer Park. Fantastic. It's a typical deer park shape, rectangular with rounded corners. It's bounded by a wall called a park pale. That's the lodge in the middle, Tankersley Old Hall. And you can see that these are the lawns. Can you see the dotted trees? These are supposed to be these old trees. And if you get up close and see the original, you can see that there are a deer being brought to a feeding station over there. And the other thing that you can see, I don't know if you can see it from here, but there are fish ponds. Deer parks always had fish ponds because everybody needed fish for feast days and Lent. And rabbits were kept in deer parks as well, in special mounds called pillow mounds. And both the rabbits and the fallow deer were introduced by the Normans. They're not native to this country. Tankersley Old Hall, of course, has become famous in the 20th century because that's where the book Kes was based. You know the story, don't you, about the boy who goes out and sees this kestrel coming out of a ruin, and it's at Tankersley Old Hall. And the author, Barry Hines, lived just across the road from Tankersley Park in Hoyland Common. This is the base of a fish pond in Kimberworth Deer Park. It's in Gallery Bottom Wood.
Shouldn't be ringing, sorry. Switched it off.
And most deer parks had these places. This is the turret house in Sheffield Deer Park. And if you go up into this upstairs room, there are stairs up onto the roof. Because the whole point of these buildings in a deer park was that you had your dessert when you had a meal. You went to a different building, the turret house, went up onto the roof to view the landscape. And there's a magnificent one in Chatsworth Park. This is the old Queen's Head, which is now in the transport interchange in Sheffield. But that was a banqueting house in the deer park. The Earl would take his visitors round the deer park to see the deer, see the fish ponds, magnificent, and then they'd come back there and have a meal. And there's an inventory that survived from the 1500s that's got all the forms and tables and cooking equipment and everything for it. And of course it's nearby to Pont Street. And Pont Street wasn't an industrial pond, it wasn't a dam for a water wheel, it was where they kept their fish in the deer park. Now, not better to see this, but this is an extract from a document that was produced between 1592 and 1616. We don't know the exact date, but we know that it's that date because it was addressed to the 7th Earl of Shrewsbury, and he became Earl of Shrewsbury in 1592 and he died in 1616. And it lists nearly 50 Sheffield and Rotherham woods and tells you exactly what they were like. And this is what the big change that was taking place. Because the population was going fast, land was being cleared for agriculture, woods were diminishing in size, and they had to manage them in a different way than wood pasture, where you just went in and cut what you wanted when you wanted it. It had got to be restricted. And there became private woodlands, and what this list is a list of spring woods. And every wood in Sheffield was called a spring, including Wincobank Wood. It was Winco Spring. And a spring has nothing to do with water. A spring is a coppice wood. It's called a spring because when you cut it down to ground level, it springs back. And you cut the tree down to a stool. You can see the new growth coming. That's a coppice stool, and every wood was coppiced. You cut it, left it for about 20 years and came back and cut it again, and it can go on forever. And this is a simple coppice because they're cutting down every tree in it. There's a different type of coppice wood in South Yorkshire. And this thing in the middle, that is a cord. It's a pile of wood that's 4 feet wide, 8 feet long, and when you fill it up, 4 feet high. And that each piece of wood is called cordwood, and when you fill it up, it's called a cord. And the 4 foot length of wood are the basic building equipment for making a charcoal stack. We photographed that wood in a coppice wood in Kent about 20 years ago. And that's what it looks like when it's grown. And there are a lot of old coppice stools in Wincobank Wood. And each one needs recording. This is coppice to standard. You can see the stool, but look at these. These are single-stemmed timber trees. That's the way that coppicing was done in South Yorkshire. You cut down a certain number of trees to ground level, but there were about 60 per acre. You left as single-stemmed trees. The coppice produced wood. The standards produced timber. 2 completely different products. The wood was for making charcoal, basically, with small stuff, and used for crafts. Timber was for building projects. So you got 2 different products in the wood. And you let the timber trees grow through 3, 4, 5, 6 coppice cycles until it was very big to the size you wanted it. This is a local wood. You can still see the coppice and standards. Standard coppice. And the beauty of a coppice wood when it's managed like this is that when they cut the coppice down, the sunlight gets in and you get these fantastic displays of spring flowers. These are wood anemones. And then as the coppice grows, it gets less and less and less, and then it starts again after 20 years when you cut it. And when you go into a worked coppice wood, it's absolutely beautiful with these sheets of wild flowers. This is a famous painting done by a Flemish artist showing coppice with standards. You can see the coppice down here, and you can see the standards here. That could be a local wood. That could be Conisbrough Castle, and they're on a boar hunt. This is from the 1500s. And this is the way that Wincobank Wood was managed from the early, well, from the middle of the 16th century until 1904, when the last record I've ever found of it being managed. And they were still cutting copies, and guess where the copies went? It went to the owner of Grimesthorpe Colliery for pit props. And because you were cutting the copies down to ground level, let it grow back, you've got to keep grazing animals out or they'd eat it and ruin the crop. So what you did, you either had a bank and a ditch, and you can see there's a ditch because you can see one of the pigs in there. You let the animals in after about 10 years when they couldn't do any damage. So that's obviously the pannage season, and there's a bank and a ditch. But in this area, you usually get walls rather than ditches surrounding woodlands. I mean, look at the size of this. That's the ditch, and look at the size of that bank. It's as wide as this room. This is in a wood called Bradfield Woods in Suffolk, which is, it's one of the best woodlands in Europe. And you can see that there's still pollarding trees on the bank. Look at this. Bank, a ditch now filled in with debris, and a wall. And that's very local, that's Grenna Woods. And it wasn't only animals you've got to keep out of your coppice wood, you've got to keep people out. Because at certain times of the year, trespassers would go in. They'd pinch wood and timber. They'd also go in for firewood, loose stuff hanging about on the ground. They'd take hazelnuts and blackberries and crab apples, and you've got to keep them out. So what do the local landowners do? Look at this. Whereas the woods and wood fences in the lordship of Beechip have for several years suffered great damage about this season of the year from a set of idle people who style themselves nutters, this is to give notice that they're going to be prosecuted. And there was a similar notice that went up around all the Duke of Norfolk's woods in Sheffield, including Wincobank. And I found similar notices in the Yorkshire Dales, in Hampshire, all over the place. That was 1809. People were taken to court all the time. And I mean, once you got coppicing, you got all these crafts. You got crafts before coppicing, of course. This is an oak canoe. It's now Western Park Museum. And it's found not very far from here, where Templeborough Steelworks are, just the other side of the Tinsey Viaduct. And it's an Iron Age canoe, 1500 BC, something like that. It's the oldest timber artefact known in South Yorkshire. And it wouldn't have been for going on the river. The whole of the area where Meadowhall is, that would have been a big marshland. Well, they went across it by canoe. And as I say, the timber was for building projects. So saw pits were found in the wood yards and in the woods themselves. And this is the saw pit, of course, that's the origin of the term top dog and underdog. The underdog was the sawyer down below getting all the sawdust in his eyes. So that building becomes important. This is a Crook building, this is in Concord Park, where you take a bent tree and cut it lengthways to make a pair of matching blades. And west of Rotherham in South Yorkshire, we know of 100 Crook buildings that either still exist or have been taken down since 1900. They were usually used for barns. This is another half-timbered house, one of the few still standing in Sheffield, Bishop's House Museum, 17th century, and it would have been timber right down to the ground at one time. It's worth investigating in detail. You can see all the ads marked on the timbers inside. And these are called studs, the black things, out of timber. And this close studding, where they're close together, is typical of the north of England. So here, this is where they were repairing a house. You can see that that's a timber post, but you can see that all this stuff is coppice stuff. And you can actually see where they cut it. And then that would be covered by daub. As I say, most of the domestic dwellings, the churches, the castles, they would all have been out of timber. Sheffield Castle was out of timber before it was made out of stone. This is called a king post roof, and you'll notice that it's not held together by metal nails, but by wooden pegs called tree nails. That's in the house that we live in, and we've got 189 trees in the roof. This is another picture of that Gunthwaite barn that I mentioned. It's well worth a visit. It's absolutely fantastic. It looks as if it was built yesterday, but it's 300 or 400 years old. We're on the second reel. Are you still with us? So wood pastures given way to coppice, and coppice gives rise to all these crafts and industries. There he is building his charcoal stack from these 4-foot lengths of coppice wood. There it is, finished. And then you cover that with turf and dust and anything you can find to keep the air in. And then you drop hot coals down the middle, and it burns for anything from 2 to 10 days. And the place where it was done in the woods was called a charcoal hearth or a pitstead. And you need to look for these in Wincobank Wood. 300 have been identified just in Ecclesall Woods. This is a photograph of one of the last charcoal making sites in South Yorkshire. This is down at Rockley near Worsborough. So that's the charcoal stack. You can see the hut that the charcoal makers lived in. You can't see any coppice because they've cut it all down, so those are the timber trees of various ages. And that could be a medieval scene, except there's a motorbike and sidecar in the middle. That was taken in 1916. And this drawing is fantastic. The charcoal maker's hut and the charcoal makers with the saw and the swill baskets down on the left. And look on the right. Can you see the little hut they've made for the dog? And they had to live in the woods in the coaling season, which lasted from April to about November. And every Sheffield wood would have been full of charcoal makers at one time or another.
What were the marks on the trunks of the trees for?
Ah, go back. That's to show you that it's not got to be cut down. That was a change, because earlier there would have been red marks. It was called raddle, a red paint. But then they changed it to white. And the trees that were going to come down, they marked them with what's called a scribe iron. They put a little mark on it, or a number.
Now, was the raddle an old word for ruddle?
Ruddle and raddle are the same things, yes.
Because of the marking of the sheep.
What?
Marking of the sheep.
Oh yeah, that's the same thing.
Ruddleman.
Yeah, and the one of the main places where they made it was just further east from here at Micklebring.
That's right.
In Yorkshire, in Doncaster district. I've got a new book coming out which you can look for, called Gapping, Raddling and Snagging. And it's a glossary of all the technical terms with woodland management in South Yorkshire over the last 1,000 years. Gapping is rebuilding the walls around the woods when they've been knocked down when they're taking trees out. Raddling is putting the red on the trees to say, don't take me down. And snagging, we'll come to that in a bit. This is what you find when you're going deep into Ecclesall Woods. You suddenly come across these wrought iron railings with a gravestone in the middle. And this is the grave to George Yardley, wood collier, who was burnt to death in his cabin on October 11, 1786. And what's interesting is the people who paid for it to be put up. One is a salesman selling wood and timber out of the wood. Another one is a gamekeeper who looked after the woods. Another one is a besom maker, the brooms. And the last one is an innkeeper. And the last one, the innkeeper, at that time was the landlord of the Rising Sun just outside Ecclesall Woods. Have you got the picture? Joe Yardley goes, he has 1 pint too many. He comes back to his hut in the woods. He goes to sleep in his hut and his pipe drops out of his mouth lit. And he goes up in smoke. Oh, we've investigated all the burial registers for 6 miles around and there's no sign of him. The fire must have burnt for so long there's nothing to bury. And that's a unique monument. There isn't another one like that in the country. Now this is another unique feature. This is, you can see it's got a rim round it. The tree's irrelevant. The tree's grown up since it was done. The rim, and there's a sort of spout at that end. This is called a Q-pit or a white coal kiln. Not charcoal, but white coal. And white coal was where you put coppice poles on stones and lit a fire underneath to get rid of the moisture. And it was a halfway spot between raw timber and charcoal. And it's used for smelting lead. And what they did, they brought the lead out of the Peak District of Derbyshire, which had few wood left, into South Yorkshire. And there are 150 of these just in Ecclesall Woods. And of course the Abbeydale Industrial Hamlet was a lead making site before it made anything else. This is another important product, bark, oak bark. As the trees were felled, it was taken off and it was made into a liquor at a tannery, a leather tannery. And the hides, the animal hides, were put in these liquor tanks and it made them supple and preserved them from deterioration for making things out of leather before they made boots and shoes and saddles and bellows and God knows what. And there's umpteen tanneries in South Yorkshire. One of the most famous one was run by Henry Clegg of Barnsley, who had tanneries at Cawthorne. And if you go to Cawthorne, to Cannon Hall, you go down Bart Lane to get to the park. He had another tannery at Denby Dale. And he had shops in Barnsley. Besom making. These brooms that everybody had for sweeping the floors. And this bit, without the handle on it, was called a swale, and is used in all the steelworks in the Lower Don Valley. And every steelworks had a big barn full of twigs like that, and they used to throw these swales onto the steel as it was coming out of the rollers, and it got rid of the crud that develops on the steel as it's coming out. And there wasn't any technical advancement on that. And right until the 1960s, as I say, every steel firm had a big barn. And if you go to Calamala Museum, there's a film where they're making steel plate for a nuclear power station in a firm in Sheffield, and these men are throwing these birch twigs on. And that had a special name. In the Latin documents, it's called ramilia. And we know it as rammel. And that's a Sheffield dialect word now for rubbish. But it was just the twigs. This is a man called William Dronfield. And he lived in Grenoside. And he made clog soles. And you only use one type of tree for making clog soles, alder, because it's waterproof. And he and his father worked as a clog saw maker in Grenoside for nearly a century. These were the baskets that were on that drawing of the charcoal maker's hut. These are called swill or spelt baskets. And the frame of hazel, and then the basket itself, you wove thin strips of oak which you boiled. You boiled it and then you pulled it off in thin strips to make the basket. And there was a family of basket makers, the Sharp family, who lived in Grenoside. And there were basket makers just down in Attercliffe as well, another famous family. So, I mean, that's the background, that's the sort of heritage. We've gone through wildwood to wood pasture to coppice woods, and then, we no longer need the woods apparently. They just stand there looking at you. And they've stood there and looked at you in Sheffield for 100 years. How do you identify an ancient wood? Well, they're usually on parish boundaries, and Wincobank Wood is right near the boundary of Ecclesfield. They're usually on steep slopes. A lot of South Yorkshire's ancient woods end in cliff, like Thorncliffe and Hudcliffe in the Sheaf Valley. And Treaton Wood used to be called Oakencliffe, a steep wood made entirely of oak. And you can always tell an ancient wood from its irregular shape. This is a wood at Totley called Gilfield Wood. Look at the shape of that. And can you see these broad hedges? You can see where they cleared that field to make that wood. And you can see the broad hedges over here. You can see that this all was wood. And when you look at the names of the fields and translate them from the Anglo-Saxon and Old Norse, almost every field around that wood, its name means, I was once part of this wood and I've been cleared to make an agricultural field. And they're full of archaeology. I've already mentioned charcoal hearth. There's Iron Age forts like you've got here. This is in Skulls Coppice as well. But there wouldn't have been any woodland there when that fort was there, and there wouldn't have been any woodland here on the top of the hill where the fort was here, because the last thing you wanted if you built a fort was for the enemy to creep up on you through the undergrowth. So you'd have cleared the wood, and it's only after the fort was abandoned that it grew back as a wood. And you often find archaeology like this. This is where there's been a charcoal maker's hut. And the other thing is that you can go and look, there's a group of plants called botanical indicators of ancient woodland. That your typical trees and shrubs and flowers and herbs and grasses and sedges that you only find in ancient woods. And you can go around in spring. It's a wonderful thing to do with your identification book, ticking them off. And if you buy one of my books, there's a list in there of all the woodland indicators you expect to find in South Yorkshire. I've already mentioned sessile oak. Notice that there are no stalks on the acorns, but there are stalks on the leaves. Bluebell is the most common of these woodland indicators, and you're not very far from the best bluebell wood in South Yorkshire, Woolly Wood. In spring, it's 1.5 miles long. It's just blue from one end to the other. Wood anemone. These are all indicators of ancient woodland. The point is that they don't set seed very well, and they spread vegetatively, and they can't jump into new woodlands. And we know that there are plantations that have been there for 300 or 400 years old, 300 or 400 years, and they don't contain any of these indicators. Yellow archangel. That's a wonderful indicator, and it's a type of nettle. And if it's not got flowers on, one way of identifying it is it's got a square stalk. And as you're feeling for the square stalk, if you get nettle, you know it isn't yellow archangel. wood sorrel. That's that common cowrie that I said that the ants love. And it's only found in a few woods in South Yorkshire, Greener Wood being where it's most prolific. Ramsons, wild garlic. And of course, if that's not in flower, you'd recognise it by standing on it and the scent comes up. That's it again. You get these wonderful drifts of it. And as I've talked about place names, woodland place names, what about this? Ramsbottom. Now, Ramsbottom, which is a place in Lancashire, it has nothing to do with sheep's backsides at all. It means a deep wooded valley full of ramsons. And, you know, as I say, these woods have stood and looked at us for 100 years and people have not known how to manage them. I mean, that's lovely for that old lady with her dog because she feels safe. Nobody's going to jump out on her. There's plenty of sunlight. But it's not as the woodland would have looked. And the big problem of the last 20, 30 years is how to manage South Yorkshire's woodlands for recreation and natural history because we don't need the timber and wood out of them anymore. I mean, that's what most woodlands look like. That's Herringthorpe Wood in Rotherham. It's been abandoned as a coppice wood and they've planted in it non-native trees like sweet chestnut and beech. And the canopy is so dense that there's no shrub layer and nothing growing on the floor because the sun can't get in, which it would have done in a coppice wood. And it's been in the last 20, 30 years since I identified all these ancient woodlands that started to manage them again. This is me taking the parish council of Tankersley Parish round Thorncliffe Wood to tell them what they could do if they bought their local wood. And their local wood was called Broad Ing Plantation, and it was an ancient woodland site that had been bought by the Forestry Commission and planted up with sycamore and Japanese larch. And they were told by the Countryside Commission that if they got somebody to do a woodland management plan, they'd arrange for them to buy it in a closed sale from the Forestry Commission to keep the cost down. So I did the management plan for them, and they bought it in 1985. That's it after a bit of management had taken place, to let some light in. And that's the sign outside, Broading Wood, your community wood, and they're on their third management plan there now. This was a big breakthrough. This happened in 1999, and you can see there's a famous politician there called Blunkett. And that's the man at the microphone is Richard Walker, who was running the South Yorkshire Forest Partnership at the time, and that was announcing that a lottery bid had been successful, and the lottery bid was to manage 35 ancient woodlands across South Yorkshire, and it was based on the books that I'd written, and it was successful to the tune of £1.6 million, and it gave rise to a 6-year project which involved management, interpretation, education, archaeological surveys, the lot. So this was a scene in Sheffield, 22. There were 22 in Sheffield, 11 in Rotherham and 2 in Barnsley involved. This is Roe Wood, managed for the first time for a century. And I mean, people were very much afraid that if you cut a tree down, that was it. This is Nick Selwood, who used to be the woodland officer for Rotherham, and he's standing at the side of a shrub that's been coppiced, and that's 1 year's growth. This is an old student of mine called Steve Vickers, who's got a degree in countryside management, and either on a full-time or a part-time basis for the last 20 years he's been going around demonstrating woodland crafts. This is bodging, which was the craft that was so common in the Chilterns for making Windsor chairs. Hurdle making, or as they're known in South Yorkshire, flakes. F-L-E-A-K-S. Snagging. Snagging is the removal of timber with horses rather than wheeled vehicles. And the point is that if you use horses instead of wheeled vehicles, it protects the archaeology and the ground flora. And that we took that photograph in Woollywood 5 years ago. Craftsmen are still knocking about. This is a basket maker at a woodland fair in Woollywood. There's still a few charcoal makers around as well. There we are. And using this method you can produce charcoal in hours rather than days. And we import something like 80,000 tonnes of barbecue charcoal every year from unmanaged woodlands, and it could all be from local woods. That's charcoal made from wood coppiced in Wath wood. As I say, the project that from the lottery was called Fueling a Revolution. And the idea was that it was the woodland that fueled the Sheffield Rotherham steel industry. And this is me with among the people, the Mayor of Rotherham, opening a trail in Canklow wood. And we've done information boards, leaflets, numpteen things for all Rotherham woods. This is an information board outside Ecclesall Woods. We've done umpteen leaflets, including one on Wincobank, of course. And there's public art. This is the Wireman of the Woods in a woodland on Hind Common in Firth Park. And the since chopped off those two bits above his head, but it was wonderful when it was there because every spring his hair grew. This is done by the same sculptor, what's his name again? Jason Thompson. This is the Wireman of the Woods. It's Sheffield's answer to the Angel of the North. It's big. We've got a photograph of the mayor and the sculptor standing on his shoulders. And this is to show the relationship between the Sheffield steel industry and woodlands, in that charcoal was the fuel. That's in Bowden Housesteads Woods up the Sheffield Parkway. And if you manage your wood properly, I mean, it's just like being in heaven. So that's a typical ancient wood on a steep slope. I think that might be woolly wood. And deer parks. You can still go and see the deer in the deer parks at Wentworth Woodhouse and Wentworth Castle. But this is a very special deer park. This is Bradgate Park in Leicestershire, and it's full of deer and ancient trees. It's absolutely magnificent. Look at that. Look at all those woodland indicators and the coppice behind. That's in Kingswood at Elsicker. Now what's interesting is that I usually show this slide. Now I mention Barry Hines' name again because after he published Kes and it was made into a film, he was invited to all these literary festivals to give talks about the book and so on. And in his latest book he said that when he was in the south of England he was always asked an ignorant question. And the ignorant question was, how is it you know so much about natural history and you're from Barnsley? Well, this is why he knew so much about natural history. Because he was surrounded by woodlands and deer parks and wooded commons like this. Thank you very much.